Okay, moving on to topic two, and this is the Mongols. And with the title of the unit is calling the Mongol Empire and the Making of the Mongol World. And you see in the back a map of the Mongol Empire. Okay, who were the Mongols? They come from this area in red in northwest Central Asia. They're kind of between China and Russia, operating in a borderland, and this is throughout their history as China and Russia became more powerful. Led to a lot of issues for the Mongolians. It is a harsh, open grassland, really a tough place to live. The people that live there, even to today, for the most part, are pastoralists. They lived on horseback. They were nomadic. They moved from pasture land to pasture land. And these are some of the world's finest horsemen, and really some of the world's finest horses also grew up in this area. Probably the greatest cavalry forces or army that the world has ever seen was the Mongolian army of Genghis Khan. Okay, so we're going to kind of track on that chart you have the growth of Genghis Khan and how he went from being just a kid warrior from an outcast family to probably the most powerful man on the planet, at least during his lifetime. He comes from a very insignificant background. His father was murdered as part of a tribal dispute early on, and the family is really outcast from the tribe. Over time, Genghis develops an ability to lead men, to conquer, and he gradually, through a series of times, takes out revenge on the people that outcast he and his family, and gradually conquers all the local tribes in his area, and then strings together, once he develops a sizable army, strings together a series of military victories to conquer the other remaining tribes of the area, and leads to his rise of dominance. He is later elected the Great Khan at what is called a Kurultai. This is simply just a gathering of all the Mongol peoples. It's a truly remarkable rise to power from nothing to everything. He unifies the Mongol tribes and then leads them onto a period of conquest that is unprecedented in world history. And a lot of the reason to conquer was to give them something to do to keep them from fighting amongst themselves. And they spread out over the next 50 years under Genghis and his sons and grandchildren, and conquered most of what we would call Eurasia. In his Khanate, it's originally under Genghis, and I'll have some maps up later. It spread across much of Asia, as we're going to see on the maps as we go along. Genghis in war was brutal. Generally, he gave you had three chances to surrender. They would show up and they would construct what was called the White Tent. And during that time, you could surrender, accept Mongol rule, pay your tribute, and pretty much go along as you did. Then they came the Black Tent, I believe it was next. No, the Red Tent, which meant you could surrender, but you were going to probably receive some sort of punishment. At least your leadership would. And it would be slightly more harsh rule. And then if you declined to go to that, then they put up the Black Tent, which meant scorched earth. They were going to destroy not only you and your people, but also wipe your settlement or your city off the earth. And really, this becomes an early example of destruction, and it leads to the Mongols gaining this reputation. And as time went on, conquest usually became easier because people just surrendered the minute they arrived. Very few were foolish enough to test their mettle against the Mongols. And it's simply because Genghis's armies were better led and better organized than his enemies for the key to success. And the tactics he employed just gave him so much audacity and success in battle. They did use siege weapons that they acquired from the Chinese, both through conquest and purchase, and they used these successfully to conquer some of the larger cities that they eventually come across. During peacetime, Genghis was a pretty tolerant ruler. He allowed others to practice their own religions. The Mongol religion is based in Mongolia, and really is of the Mongolian people, and they did not make any attempt to spread it. So they allowed people to continue as they were. He developed a very merit-based society. If you had something to offer, he was interested. If you didn't, he wasn't. And conquered people are allowed to work for the empire and work all over their empire to use their skills to gain prominence and wealth. And this leads to not only an expansion of cultural spread, but also the expansion of trade. Okay. Next up, and this expansion of trade and this conquest leads to what becomes known as the Pax Mongolica. And it's really about 100 years of peace along the trade routes of Asia. The Mongols promoted trade as long as they got a cut. As long as they got their peace, they were happy to let you do what you wanted to do. And they really created a unified single trade network throughout the empire, facilitated by a lot of the communication systems that they put in place to connect their empire. Okay, after Genghis dies, you can see from the map the Khanate split into 4 parts for each of his sons. The Great Khan, who was actually his 3rd son, kept the biggest piece, the green here. That included China and Mongolia. His 2nd son got what became known as the Chagatai Khanate, named after him. Then you had the Ilkhanate, which became Persia and much of the Middle East and Afghanistan. And then you had the Khan of the Golden Horde, which actually went to his oldest son, who he and Genghis had a very poor relationship. And a lot of that stems from an episode early on in Genghis's life when his wife had been kidnapped. She was probably raped by her captors, and she had a son which Genghis was never quite convinced was his. He did not dote on him the way he did the others. The splitting of the Khanate as it was, and where the owing of due still to the Great Khan, the son, causes friction and later separation between the 4 Khanates. So here's a little bit of background in each of those. So the Golden Horde is Russia. That's the yellow behind you. It's a really brutal conquest and slaughter of the Russian people. And a lot of it is because the Mongols felt they had nothing, the Russians had nothing to offer them. The religious tolerance that the Mongols practice does lead to a strengthening of the Orthodox Church, and it really becomes a pillar of Russian society. They heavily taxed the Russians, and the Russians actually copy a lot of the Mongol governing style that will hold through even into the more modern times. The Mongols are the only people to ever successfully conquer Russia. Okay, the Ilkhanate, that is the part in the kind of darker purple. That becomes Persia and also culminates with the sacking of Baghdad. It's a brutal contest, a conquest, a disaster for the Persian, with lots of destruction of their cities, but also of their agricultural land as the Mongols turned it into pasture land. But it gradually, over time, the Mongols kind of go native. They convert to Islam, and there's really a heavy Persian influence on the Mongol systems of governance in this Ilkhanate. The Yuan dynasty is really China, okay, and it adopted the Mongols adopt many of the Chinese governing techniques because China is a totally different place to govern. It's a much more agricultural society, and so they use many of the Chinese things, but they do a lot to avoid adopting any Chinese culture. And it's a very discriminatory rule against the Chinese, often brutal. They support the merchants and artisans, but they don't support the Confucian bureaucracy. They really kind of repudiate the Confucian style of government, and they totally forbid intermarriage between Mongols and Chinese. And then finally you have the Chagatai Khanate, which is the smallest and really the least significant of these. It's really the most Mongolian. It remains true to the Mongol culture. A lot of it is because of the location on the northern steppes here in Central Asia. That's the kind of light purple. But it is also the first of the Khanates to break away from the Great Khan. Okay, Mongol China. Kublai Khan, the most significant Mongol ruler of China. He took on many aspects of Chinese culture. He was criticized by Mongols. especially his brothers, for going native and adopting Chinese style. He proved that he was still a Mongol by fighting a series of wars and personal combats against some of his brothers to keep his title of Great Khan. Marco Polo wrote extensively about him and the wonders of his empire. Much of his writing described the networks that really had already existed but were new to Europeans. The Mongols fall simply because they really grew too big, and they could not continue to be unified. Many of the local rulers over time stopped paying tribute. When you get down to the grandson and great grandsons of of Genghis, and many of the Mongols go native, especially in the Okanet and in China. And then eventually the Ming dynasty comes along and overthrows the Yuan using gunpowder to do it. They were helped by years of plague and rebellion and factional fighting, all those things that lead to the loss of a mandate of heaven, and then just a simple hatred of the Mongols. Long-term impact of the Mongols. The reputation as savage conquerors has survived forever. The Pax Mongolica, with the century of trade and peace across Asia, the cultural exchange with the spread of religion, movement of people and ideas, the Black Death, and the transfer of disease around the world. Centralized power really ends a lot of centralized power in my mind. There's really more of a decentralized rule of Asia that will last for centuries. And then the spread of ideas and techniques of fighting methods. Many of those techniques were used to overthrow the Mongols later. So last little bit here is on change and continuity, and I have these in reverse order how they're in your packet. First is change. Religious toleration comes into effect under the Mongols. They allow for it and allow for the flow of religion. There's the expansion of the European trade routes and an increased contact between regions, especially between the Yuan China and the caliphates. There will be a huge trade development. Continuity, the religions that are there stay there. The idea of local rule continues. And the Mongol culture really doesn't spread. The Mongol culture stays in Mongolia. And the older cultures of Russia and China and the old caliphates of the Islamic world all pretty much remain intact, and as the Mongols fade away, come back into place. So that's the Mongols, and that's all you need. And you can see that if you watch for a second, the chart of their progression in the background.